The small bell above the door jingled as Beth Wilson pushed open the heavy glass door of the Mountain Creek shooting range. The smell of gun oil and coffee hit her immediately. She clutched her registration paperwork tightly, creasing the edges with her nervous fingers. At 43, Beth hadn't expected to find herself signing up for shooting lessons. But the break-in at her neighbor's apartment last month had changed things. The front desk was manned by an older gentleman with a salt and pepper beard who barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. "I'm here for the beginner's handgun safety course," Beth said, sliding her paperwork across the counter. "It starts today at 6. The man glanced at her form, then at Beth herself, taking in her sensible cardigan, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and the practical shoes of someone who spent hours on her feet shelving books at the county library. "Through those double doors," he said, pointing with his pencil. "They're probably already starting." Beth thanked him and hurried toward the classroom, already feeling like she was swimming against the current. When she pushed open the door, 15 heads turned in unison to stare at her. 14 men and 1 woman, all dressed in tactical gear, hunting clothes, or clothing that screamed, "I know what I'm doing here." Beth clutched her canvas tote bag closer to her side. "You must be Wilson," said the instructor, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, who stood at the front of the room beside a table covered with unloaded handguns. His name tag read Instructor Reynolds. Beth nodded, feeling her cheeks flush. "Sorry I'm late. The paperwork took—" "We're just getting started," Reynolds cut her off, gesturing to an empty chair in the back corner. "Safety brief first, then we'll handle some firearms." Beth made her way to the empty seat, painfully aware of the eyes following her. The chair squeaked loudly as she sat down, making her wince. "As I was saying," Reynolds continued, "this 6-week course will cover safety, handling, maintenance, and basic marksmanship. By the end, those who pass the final assessment will receive their certification." A man in the front row raised his hand. "Will we be doing any tactical drills?" Beth noticed his perfectly fitting shooting gloves and the confident way he leaned back in his chair. Something about his posture said he already knew the answer, but wanted everyone else to know he knew what tactical drills were. "This is a beginner's course, Vince," Reynolds replied with a hint of familiarity. "But yes, we'll incorporate some basic movement and drawing techniques in the later weeks." Vince nodded, satisfied, and Beth could see several others in the class looking at him with something like respect. Reynolds began the safety briefing, going through the basic rules of firearm handling. Beth listened intently, taking notes in her small spiral notebook while others in the class occasionally exchanged knowing glances or nodded with bored familiarity. She noticed that Vince didn't take a single note, instead casually checking his watch or scanning the room. "Now," Reynolds said after finishing the safety rules, "let's get hands-on with some basic handling. These firearms are all unloaded and checked. We'll practice proper grip, stance, and trigger discipline." The class moved to the demonstration table, forming a semicircle around the displayed handguns. Beth found herself squeezed to the outer edge, barely able to see past the shoulders of 2 taller men. "Who has previous experience?" Reynolds asked. Nearly every hand went up except Beth's and a nervous-looking young man's. Vince raised his hand highest. "I competed in the state championships last year," he said. "Placed 4th overall." Reynolds nodded appreciatively. "Good to know. Maybe you can help demonstrate for us later, Vince." The instructor picked up one of the handguns, a black semi-automatic. "This is a standard 9mm, similar to what many of you will end up choosing for personal protection. Let me demonstrate the proper grip." Beth strained to see, rising slightly on her tiptoes. The man in front of her shifted, unknowingly blocking her view completely. Too shy to ask him to move, she settled back down and listened instead. After the demonstration, Reynolds had everyone take turns holding the unloaded firearms. When Beth's turn came, she approached the table with studied calm, trying to remember everything she'd just heard. "Like this?" she asked, picking up the handgun with visible discomfort. Reynolds barely glanced at her. "Finger off the trigger. Higher grip on the backstrap." Beth adjusted her hands, but the gun felt alien and uncomfortable in her grasp. No, Reynolds said with a sigh. He quickly adjusted her hands, his movements efficient but impersonal, before moving on to the next student. "Next," she stepped back, face burning with embarrassment. From the corner of her eye, she caught Vince watching her with barely disguised amusement. He leaned over to whisper something to the person beside him, who snickered in response. The rest of the class followed a similar pattern. They moved to the indoor range where Reynolds demonstrated proper shooting stance. Beth tried to mirror his position, feet shoulder-width apart, slight forward lean, arms extended, but her body felt stiff and unnatural. "You look like you're about to fall over," Vince commented as he walked past her to retrieve a target. "Maybe try yoga first?" A few nearby classmates laughed, and Beth focused on adjusting her stance, pretending not to hear. When it came time for the first actual shooting practice, Beth found herself at the end of the line. She watched as others stepped up to the firing line with confidence. Even the other nervous beginner seemed to be catching on quickly. Vince took his turn with obvious skill, placing tight groupings in the center of his target. After he finished, Reynolds clapped him on the shoulder. "Looks like we've got our class ace," the instructor said, displaying Vince's target for everyone to see. "This is what you're all aiming for, folks." When Beth's turn finally came, her hands were shaking. Reynolds handed her ear protection and safety glasses with barely a word. She stepped up to the firing line, trying to remember everything at once. Grip, stance, sight alignment, trigger control. "Remember, squeeze, don't pull," Reynolds said from behind her, his attention already half turned to answering another student's question. Beth took a deep breath and fired. The recoil was stronger than she expected, and she flinched. The bullet hit the outer edge of the paper target, barely scoring any points. Her next 4 shots weren't much better, scattered widely across the target with one missing the paper entirely. "Well," Reynolds said flatly when she finished, "you've got plenty of room for improvement." As Beth removed her ear protection, she heard Vince say to his growing circle of admirers, "Some people just aren't cut out for this stuff." On her way out of the range that evening, Beth felt defeated. She walked slowly through the parking lot, the cool evening air a relief after the stuffy range. As she reached her old blue sedan, she heard footsteps behind her. "Hey, library lady," a voice called out. Beth turned to see a woman from the class, the only other female participant. She was tall with short gray hair and moved with the confidence of someone with military background. "Don't let those guys get to you," the woman said. "First day's always the worst." "I was terrible," Beth admitted. "Maybe this was a mistake." "I'm Lou," the woman said, extending her hand. 20 years Army, and trust me, everyone's terrible on day 1. Beth shook her hand. "I'm Beth, 20 years library science." "Not quite the same skill set," Lou laughed. "You'd be surprised. Both require patience and attention to detail." She looked Beth in the eye. "You coming back next week?" Beth hesitated, then nodded firmly. Yes, I am." "Good," Lou said with a nod. "The guys who talk the most usually have the most to prove. Just watch and learn. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have." As Lou walked away, Beth felt something shift inside her. She got into her car and glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. The plain, ordinary face that looked back at her had never drawn much attention. People had been overlooking her all her life. Maybe, just maybe, that was about to become her secret weapon. The library clock ticked quietly as Beth shelved the last of the returned books. It was Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before her second shooting class, and her mind kept drifting back to the disaster of her first session. The feel of the gun in her hands, awkward and foreign. The snickers from Vince and his growing posse of admirers. The way Instructor Reynolds had barely looked at her. "Beth, you've been organizing the same shelf for 10 minutes, said Gina, her supervisor, appearing around the corner with a cart of new arrivals. "Everything okay?" Beth blinked, realizing she'd been lost in thought. "Sorry, just thinking about this class I started." "The shooting one?" Gina leaned against the bookshelf. "How'd it go?" "Terribly," Beth admitted. "I was the worst one there by far. I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn." "So you're quitting?" Gina asked, raising an eyebrow. Beth thought about Lou's parting words. "About being underestimated? No. Actually, I'm going to try something different." During her lunch break, Beth wandered to the library's reference section and pulled out 3 books on marksmanship and shooting fundamentals. She found a quiet corner and began to read, taking careful notes in her small spiral notebook. The basics seemed simple enough in theory: proper stance, grip, sight alignment, breathing control, trigger squeeze. The challenge was putting it all together. That evening after work, Beth stood in front of her bathroom mirror holding a hairbrush in her hands like a pistol. She practiced her grip over and over, trying to make it feel natural. She worked on her stance in her small living room, feet shoulder-width apart, slight bend in the knees. She dry-fired an imaginary gun hundreds of times, focusing on keeping her hand steady as she squeezed an imaginary trigger. The next morning, Beth woke up early. She made a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open to shooting tutorial videos. She watched intently as experts demonstrated techniques, pausing occasionally to mimic their movements with her hands. One particular video caught her attention, the mental game of shooting, where the instructor talked about visualization and focus. 90% of shooting happens in your head, the instructor said. It's about focus, calm, and confidence. Beth thought about this as she drove to work. Confidence was something she'd always lacked, especially in rooms full of people who seemed to know what they were doing. But maybe, just maybe, she could fake it until it became real. Thursday evening arrived faster than she expected. Beth pulled into the Mountain Creek shooting range parking lot 30 minutes early. Only a few cars were there, including Reynolds' pickup truck, with an NRA sticker on the bumper. Beth took a deep breath, grabbed her notebook, and headed inside. The front desk was empty this time. Beth walked through to the classroom and found it deserted except for Reynolds, who was arranging handguns on the demonstration table. "You're early," he said without looking up. "I wanted to get some practice in before class," Beth replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "If that's okay." Reynolds glanced at her, seeming to really see her for the first time. "Sure. Lane 3 is open if you want to warm up. Box of ammo will run you $12. Beth paid for the ammunition and hearing protection, then made her way to the empty shooting lane. She stood there for a moment, looking at the paper target hanging at the end of the range. It seemed impossibly far away. She loaded the magazine carefully, following the safety procedures from the first class. Her hands trembled slightly, but less than before. She inserted the magazine, racked the slide, and took her stance. Breathe in, focus on the front sight. Breathe out halfway. Squeeze. The gun fired, the recoil more manageable this time. Beth couldn't see where her shot had landed, but she didn't let it distract her. She reset her stance, aligned her sights, and fired again, and again, and again. After emptying the magazine, she hit the button to bring her target forward. The shots were all over the place, but at least they were all on the paper this time. Progress, however small. Not terrible for a beginner, came a gruff voice behind her. Beth turned to see an elderly man with wispy white hair and thick glasses watching her. His name tag read Walt Owner. Not good either, Beth replied honestly. Walt chuckled. Nobody starts good. That's not how it works. He stepped closer, examining her stance. Try widening your stance a bit more. And relax your shoulders. You're too tense. Beth adjusted as instructed, surprised by the old man's attention. Better. He nodded. Now try again. Beth loaded another magazine and followed Walt's guidance. This time her shots clustered slightly closer together, still far from the bullseye but showing a pattern. See, improvement already, Walt said. Keep at it. By the time other students began arriving, Beth had gone through 40 rounds of practice. Her arms ached, but there was a new feeling growing inside her, a tiny seed of confidence. Vince strutted in with 3 other men, all laughing about something. He spotted Beth at the lane and raised an eyebrow. Well, look who's trying to get a head start, he said loudly enough for others to hear. Gonna need more than extra practice, library lady. Beth said nothing, just continued packing up her things. As she walked past him toward the classroom, she heard Vince add, "Some people just don't have natural talent." The comment stung. But Beth kept walking, remembering what she'd learned about the mental game. Don't let distractions in. Focus on what matters. Class began with Reynolds reviewing the previous week's safety rules. Beth sat quietly, no longer in the back corner but in the middle row. She listened intently, occasionally checking her notes but mostly watching Reynolds. How he held the demonstration firearm, the way he shifted his weight when explaining stance, the subtle adjustments he made when correcting other students. Today we'll focus on proper sight alignment and trigger control, Reynolds announced. These 2 elements make the biggest difference between hitting your target and missing completely. Beth noticed how Vince and his friends half listened, occasionally exchanging knowing glances or checking their phones. They weren't really learning. They were just confirming what they thought they already knew. When they moved to the range portion of the class, Beth found herself next to Lou, the woman who had spoken to her after the first class. You look more comfortable today, Lou observed as they set up in their lanes. I've been practicing, Beth replied. Just dry firing at home, but it helps. Lou nodded approvingly. Smart. Most people think it's all about range time, but the mental prep matters just as much. Reynolds walked down the line, giving brief instructions to each student. When he reached Beth, he paused, watching her prepare her station. Your grip is better, he said with mild surprise. Who showed you that? I watched some videos, Beth replied. And Walt gave me a few pointers earlier. Reynolds' expression changed slightly. Walt doesn't usually bother with the beginners. He studied her for a moment longer. Let's see what you can do today. When it was Beth's turn to shoot, she tuned everything out. The whispers, the pressure, Vince watching from behind. It all faded away as she focused on her breathing and sight picture. Her first shot hit the target 7 ring, not center but respectable. Her second was similar. By her 5th shot, she had a decent grouping forming. Huh, Reynolds said when she finished, genuine surprise in his voice as he examined her target. That's significantly better, Wilson. From the next lane over, Vince fired his round, hitting the bullseye with nearly every shot. Reynolds moved to praise him, and the moment of recognition Beth had experienced evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. As the class wrapped up, Reynolds announced, Next week we'll be working on drawing from holsters and shooting from different positions. Study your manual sections 3 and 4. Beth packed up her things quietly, feeling a mix of pride and frustration. She'd improved dramatically, yet still remained largely invisible among the more experienced shooters. In the parking lot, Lou caught up with her again. You've been holding out on us, library lady. Those weren't beginner shots. Beth smiled slightly. Just trying to learn. Well, keep learning like that and you'll surprise everyone. Lou paused, then added, including yourself. Driving home? Beth felt something she hadn't felt in years. A quiet determination that burned steady and warm. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to be noticed. She was trying to be good at something purely for herself. She pulled into her apartment complex and sat for a moment in her car, thinking about Walt's words. Nobody starts good. That's not how it works. The journey from bad to good, that was the interesting part. And for once, Beth was embracing the journey instead of fearing it. As she walked up to her apartment, she found herself already planning tomorrow's practice routine. The mental drills she would run. The stance adjustments she would make. The videos she would watch. The plain, ordinary woman that everyone overlooked was beginning to discover something extraordinary within herself, and nobody at the shooting range had any idea what was coming. The weekend passed in a blur of research and practice for Beth. She spent Saturday morning at the public library, not as an employee but as a patron, digging through books on marksmanship that she hadn't checked out yet. One particular volume caught her attention, a dusty memoir by a champion shooter from the 1970s. The book contained not just techniques, but mental approaches that resonated with her. The quiet ones make the best shooters, the author had written. They watch, they learn, and they don't waste energy trying to impress others. Sunday afternoon, Beth drove 40 minutes to a sporting goods store in the next county. She felt out of place among the camo-clad hunters and gun enthusiasts, but she pushed through her discomfort. After browsing for nearly an hour, she approached a clerk for help. I need a pair of shooting gloves, she said, trying to sound confident. And nothing fancy, just functional. The young clerk looked her up and down. Target shooting or hunting? Target, Beth replied. I'm taking a class. 20 minutes and $60 later, Beth left with a pair of basic shooting gloves and a small notebook designed for recording range sessions. It wasn't much, but it felt like a commitment to this new path she was on. That night, Beth couldn't sleep.
She kept thinking about the next C.
Wondering if her improvement would continue or if she'd hit a plateau. Around midnight, she got up and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. Her apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Beth opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old wooden box she rarely touched. Inside was a collection of items that had belonged to her father, his pocket watch, a few faded photographs, and a small notebook with a worn leather cover. She ran her fingers over the embossed initials, R.W., Robert Wilson. Her father had died when she was 12, a sudden heart attack that left Beth and her mother reeling. Before his death, he'd taught Beth a few things about shooting during their rare camping trips. Nothing formal, just the basics of a .22 rifle at tin cans. But she remembered how patient he'd been, how his voice had never risen in frustration when she missed shot after shot. "Take your time, Bethy," he would say. "The target isn't going anywhere." Beth opened the notebook filled with her father's neat handwriting. Detailed notes about different firearms, shooting conditions, and techniques. She'd never read it carefully before. It had been too painful after his death. Now, she turned the pages slowly, absorbing his wisdom across the decades. One passage caught her eye. "The secret isn't in the hands, it's in the mind. A scattered mind means scattered shots. Find your center and the bullseye will find you." Beth closed the notebook and held it to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt close to her father again. She tucked the notebook into her range bag before going back to bed. Monday evening, Beth drove to the range after work. She wasn't scheduled for class until Thursday, but she wanted more practice time. The parking lot was half full, mostly regulars, she guessed, from the confident way they carried their range bags. Inside, Walt was behind the counter this time, squinting through his thick glasses at a catalog. "Evening," he said, recognizing her. "Back for more?" Beth nodded. "If there's a lane open, lane 4's free. You got your own firearm or you need to rent?" "Still renting for now," Beth replied. She hesitated, then added, "I was wondering, do you offer any one-on-one instruction?" Walt studied her over the rim of his glasses. "Reynolds does private lessons. $100 an hour," Beth's face fell. That was far outside her librarian's budget. Walt seemed to read her thoughts. "But I've been known to give a pointer or two for free. If someone's serious about learning." "I'm serious," Beth said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Walt nodded thoughtfully. "All right then. Get set up in lane 4. I'll come check on you after I finish this order form." Beth practiced for nearly an hour before Walt appeared beside her lane. He watched silently as she fired a full magazine, her grouping tight but consistently left of center. "You're anticipating the recoil," Walt said when she finished, "pushing the gun down slightly before it fires. How do I stop doing that?" Beth asked. "Dry fire practice helps." Walt took the unloaded gun and demonstrated. "But also try this." He adjusted her stance slightly and had her roll her shoulders before taking aim. "Keep your breathing even. Don't try to time your shots between breaths. That makes you rush. Instead, learn to shoot during your breathing cycle." Beth practiced with Walt's guidance for another hour. By the end, her groups had tightened considerably and moved closer to center. Her arms ached, but she felt a deep satisfaction. As she was packing up, Walt leaned against the divider. "You know," he said casually, "you remind me of someone." "Who's that?" Beth asked. Walt seemed to consider his words carefully. "There was a shooter who used to come here years ago. Bob Wilson. One of the best natural marksmen I ever saw." Beth froze. "Robert Wilson?" Walt's bushy eyebrows rose. "You knew him?" "He was my father," Beth said quietly. Walt removed his glasses, genuinely surprised. "Well, I'll be damned. Bob's daughter." He looked at her with new interest.
"He never mentioned you came to the range." "I didn't," Beth explained.
"Not with him. He took me shooting a few times when we went camping, but that was it. He died when I was 12, Walt nodded solemnly. "I remember. That was a damn shame. Your father was something special behind the trigger. Won the state championship 3 years running in the late 80s. Beth stared at him. What? He won championships? You didn't know?" Walt looked puzzled. "Mom never talked about his shooting after he died," Beth said. "I think it was too painful for her." Walt rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, your old man was one of the best. Had a trophy case full of awards. Nothing fancy about his technique. He just had this uncanny ability to focus, to block everything else out. Like the gun was an extension of him." Beth felt a lump in her throat. All these years, and she'd never known this side of her father. "Do you have any pictures? From the competitions?" "Might have some in the back office," Walt said. "Come by sometime when we're not busy and I'll dig through the old albums." As Beth drove home that night, her mind was racing. Her father, a championship shooter. Something stirred in her memory. A glass cabinet in their old house that had disappeared after his death. Had it contained trophies she was too young to remember? When Thursday's class arrived, Beth felt different walking through the door. She wasn't just a novice trying to improve anymore. She was Bob Wilson's daughter, carrying a legacy she hadn't known existed until now. The class began with Reynolds announcing they were moving to more advanced techniques. Today we'll work on drawing from holsters and shooting from different positions. Kneeling, sitting, and with support. Beth noticed Vince had arrived with a new holster. Clearly expensive, which he made sure everyone noticed. Custom made, he told anyone who looked. Same kind the professionals use. When they moved to the range, Reynolds demonstrated the proper technique for drawing safely from a holster. Smooth is more important than fast, he emphasized. Speed comes with practice. Beth watched intently, noticing the economy of movement in Reynolds's demonstration. When it was her turn, she focused on making each motion deliberate and controlled. Her draw wasn't the fastest, but Reynolds nodded approvingly at her technique. Good fundamentals, Wilson, he said, actually making eye contact with her. Just keep practicing the motion. From across the range, Vince called out, "Hey Reynolds, check this out." He executed a lightning-fast draw and fired 5 shots in rapid succession. 4 hit the target with 1 missing completely. Fast doesn't mean much if you're missing, Reynolds said with a frown. Control first, then speed. Vince's expression darkened, but he nodded stiffly. As the class worked on shooting from kneeling positions, Beth found herself actually helping a newer student, a middle-aged man who had joined last week and was struggling with balance. Try putting your weight on your back leg, she suggested quietly. And don't lock your supporting arm. The man tried her suggestion and improved immediately. Thanks, he said, surprised. That's much better. Lou, working in the next lane, gave Beth an approving nod. Near the end of the session, Reynolds gathered everyone around. We're halfway through the course now, he announced. In 3 weeks, we'll have the final assessment, which includes a skills test and a timed course. The highest scorer gets a free membership for a month and their name on the Wall of Fame. Beth could see Vince already smirking confidently. To prepare you, next week we'll hold a practice competition, Reynolds continued. Nothing fancy, just to give you a feel for shooting under a bit of pressure. As the class dispersed, Beth lingered, waiting until most people had left. She approached Reynolds carefully. Instructor Reynolds, she began. I was wondering if I could get some extra range time before next week's practice competition. Reynolds looked at her with mild surprise. Range is open to all members, Wilson. Just pay the hourly rate, I meant, with some guidance, Beth clarified. I want to really prepare. Reynolds considered her for a moment. You have been improving, he conceded. I could do a half-hour session before next week's class. Standard rate applies. Beth thanked him and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Did you ever know a shooter named Robert Wilson? He used to compete here. Reynolds' expression changed. Bob Wilson, of course. His picture's on the wall in the trophy room. He studied Beth's face more carefully. Wait, are you related? He was my father, Beth said. For the first time since she'd started the class, Reynolds looked at her with genuine interest. I never made the connection. Bob Wilson was before my time as an instructor, but everyone here knows that name. He was a legend. As Beth walked out to her car that evening, she felt a strange mix of emotions, pride in her father, sadness for the years of not knowing about his accomplishments, and a new fire burning inside her, a determination to honor his legacy in her own way. In her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself and was surprised to see a different person looking back, someone with purpose in her eyes. The plain, overlooked woman was still there, but something had changed inside her, something that had perhaps been there all along, just waiting to be awakened. Beth spent the weekend in her mother's attic, searching through dusty boxes that hadn't been opened in years. After 3 hours of digging, she found what she was looking for, a small wooden crate marked Bob's Things. Inside were newspaper clippings, faded ribbons, and several trophies tarnished with age. State champion, precision shooting, read one. Regional Me, Marksmanship Award, declared another. Beth ran her fingers over the engraved name, Robert Wilson. Her father, the man whose shooting legacy she'd never known about. She pulled out a faded photograph showing a younger version of her father standing proudly with a rifle, a large trophy in his other hand. His smile was wide, his posture confident, so different from the quiet man she remembered who worked as an accountant and took her camping on weekends. What are you doing up there? Her mother called from downstairs. Beth gathered a few of the items and brought them down to the kitchen where her mother was preparing lunch. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about Dad's shooting awards? Beth asked, placing the trophies and clippings on the table. Her mother's hand stilled as she looked at the dusty awards. "I put those away after he died. I couldn't bear to look at them." She picked up one of the smaller trophies. "Your father loved competing. He was so good at it. But why keep it from me? All these years I never knew this side of him." Her mother sighed, sitting down at the table. "After he died, it was just too painful, Beth. He was supposed to compete in the national championship that year. He'd been training for months." She touched a newspaper clipping gently. "I guess I wanted to protect you from feeling that same loss of what might have been." Beth's throat tightened. "Can I take some of these? To keep at my apartment?" Her mother nodded. "They're yours now. He would be proud to see you following in his footsteps." That evening, Beth sat in her apartment with her father's shooting journal open beside her, reading his notes with new understanding. His detailed observations about wind conditions, breathing patterns, and mental focus weren't just the writings of a hobbyist. They were the insights of a champion. On Monday, Beth arrived at work early and headed straight for the library's historical newspaper archives. She searched for her father's name and found several articles covering his wins at state competitions. One photo caption referred to him as the quiet marksman, known for his unassuming demeanor and extraordinary focus under pressure. That afternoon, during her lunch break, Beth drove to a small sporting goods store and purchased her first firearm, a simple 9mm handgun, similar to the rental she'd been using at the range. The purchase felt significant, like crossing a threshold from casual interest to serious commitment. Thursday arrived, bringing with it the practice competition Reynolds had announced. Beth arrived at the range 30 minutes early for her promised session with the instructor. "All right, Wilson," Reynolds said as they stood in a private lane. "Show me what you've got." Beth demonstrated her current form, firing a tight group at 15 yards. Reynolds watched with a critical eye. "Your fundamentals are solid now," he acknowledged. "But competition shooting is different. It's not just about accuracy, it's about performing under pressure." He gestured toward the range. "When everyone's watching, when there's something on the line, that's when most shooters fall apart." "How do I prepare for that?" Beth asked. "Visualization helps," Reynolds explained. "Before you shoot, see the perfect shot in your mind. But mostly it's about experience. The more you compete, the more comfortable you get with the pressure." As class members began arriving, Beth noticed Vince walking in with what looked like a brand new custom holster and matching shooting glasses. He stopped short when he saw her getting private instruction from Reynolds. "Trying to get a leg up on the competition?" he asked with a smirk. "You'll need more than a few tips to catch up to some of us." "Just working on my fundamentals," Beth replied calmly, remembering her father's journal entry about letting distractions roll off like water. Reynolds gathered the class together and explained the practice competition format. 3 stages. Precision at 20 yards, speed shooting at 7 yards, and a small obstacle course where you'll shoot from various positions. Highest combined score wins. Beth felt butterflies in her stomach as Reynolds began assigning shooting orders. She was placed in the middle of the pack with Vince going last, a position he seemed pleased with. Lou sidled up next to her as they waited. "Nervous?" she asked. "A little," Beth admitted. "Good," Lou said. "Means you care. Use it to sharpen your focus." The competition began. Beth watched as the first few shooters completed the course with varying degrees of success. Some excelled at precision but faltered on speed. Others were quick but scattered their shots. When her turn came, Beth stepped up to the firing line, aware of eyes on her back. She took a deep breath, recalling her father's words, "Find your center and the bullseye will find you." For the precision stage, Beth took her time, focusing on each shot individually. Her grouping was tight, with most hits landing in or near the center ring. Not perfect, but solid. The speed stage proved more challenging. Her draws were smooth, but not as quick as some others. Still, she managed to hit all targets, even if not dead center. The final stage, the obstacle course, required moving between 3 positions and engaging targets from behind cover. Beth moved deliberately, focusing on accuracy rather than speed. She finished with a respectable score, though not the highest of the day. When all was said and done, Beth placed 4th out of 12, a result that clearly surprised many of her classmates. Reynolds gave her a nod of approval as he recorded her score. Vince, as expected, took first place with a commanding performance, particularly in the speed shooting section where his fast draw and rapid-fire accuracy set him apart. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how it's done, Vince announced as Reynolds handed him the small trophy for the practice competition. His group of admirers clapped enthusiastically. As the class began to disperse, Beth overheard Vince talking loudly to his friends. For the real competition, I'm bringing my competition gun. Then you'll see some real shooting. Beth packed up her things quietly, reflecting on her performance. Fourth place wasn't bad for someone who could barely hit the target a month ago, but she knew she could do better. As she was leaving, Walt stopped her near the door. "Got a minute?" he asked. Beth followed him to a small office behind the front desk. The walls were covered with photographs and old competition posters. Walt pointed to a framed picture on the far wall. "Thought you might want to see this," he said. Beth moved closer and felt her breath catch. There was her father, much younger, standing with a group of shooters. A large trophy stood in front of them, and her father's hand rested on it casually like it belonged to him. "Range Team Champions 1988, Walt explained. "Your dad was our anchor shooter. When the pressure was highest, he was at his best." He tapped the glass over her father's face. "Never saw anyone with focus like Bob Wilson. He could block out everything. Noise, distractions, pressure, like he was alone on the range." Beth stared at her father's confident smile. "I wish I'd known him like this," she said softly. Walt studied her for a moment. "You shoot more like him than you realize," he said. "Today, during that practice competition, you had the same look he used to get. Right before you fired your precision shots, that was pure Bob Wilson." Beth felt warmth spread through her chest at the comparison. "There's something else," Walt said, opening a desk drawer. He pulled out a small wooden box and handed it to her. "Your dad left this here years ago. Said he'd pick it up before the national competition, but..." He trailed off. "Anyway, it's been sitting here all this time." "I think he'd want you to have it now." Beth opened the box carefully. Inside lay a pair of worn leather shooting gloves, meticulously maintained but showing signs of extensive use. A small monogram on the wrist read R.W., his lucky gloves, Walt explained. Wore them for every competition he won. Beth ran her fingers over the soft leather, imagining her father's hands wearing them, adjusting his grip, squeezing the trigger. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more past the lump in her throat. As Beth drove home that evening, her father's gloves rested on the passenger seat beside her. The upcoming final competition loomed in her mind, but it had taken on new meaning. It was no longer about proving herself to Vince or Reynolds or anyone else at the range. It was about connecting with a part of her father and herself that had been hidden for too long. At a stoplight, Beth picked up the gloves and slipped one onto her right hand. The leather felt stiff but somehow familiar, as if shaped for her grip. The light turned green and Beth drove on, her mind already planning how to improve before the final test. For the first time since starting the class, she allowed herself to imagine winning the whole thing, not just placing respectably but actually winning. The thought should have seemed ridiculous, a beginner beating experienced shooters like Vince, but somehow, with her father's gloves beside her and his blood in her veins, it didn't seem impossible at all. That night, Beth dreamed of standing on a winner's podium, a trophy in her hands, while a figure that looked like her father watched from the crowd, nodding with quiet pride. The final week before the competition flew by in a blur of practice and preparation. Beth spent every spare moment at the range working on her technique, speed, and accuracy. Her hands grew calloused, her arms stronger, and her eyes sharper. She practiced with her father's gloves until the leather S softened and molded to her hands as if they had always belonged there. Each evening after work, Beth would arrive at the range and find Walt waiting for her with a new tip or challenge. "Try this drill," he would say, or focus on transitioning between targets more smoothly. His guidance was practical and direct, never sugar-coated but never harsh. On Wednesday evening, just one day before the final competition, Beth stayed later than usual. The range was nearly empty, with only a single shooter far down at lane 1. She had been working on her draw speed, trying to find the perfect balance between speed and control. "You're getting faster," came Reynolds' voice from behind her. Beth turned, surprised to find the instructor watching her practice. He rarely paid attention to students outside of class time. "Been working on it," she replied simply. Reynolds nodded, studying her stance. "Your form has improved dramatically since you started." He hesitated, then added, Walt tells me you've been spending a lot of time here. Every day I can, Beth confirmed. It shows. Reynolds leaned against the divider. Tomorrow's competition is going to be challenging. More stages than the practice run, more complex shooting positions. He gave her an appraising look. You've got a real shot at placing high. Coming from Reynolds, who had barely noticed her existence 6 weeks ago, this was high praise indeed. Thanks, Beth said. I'm just trying to do my best. Reynolds seemed about to say more when the door opened and Vince walked in, carrying a sleek gun case. He spotted them talking and frowned slightly. Evening, Reynolds, he called, purposely ignoring Beth. Just wanted to get a few practice rounds in with my competition piece. He patted the gun case proudly. Reynolds nodded to him, then turned back to Beth. Keep working on that draw speed, but remember, accuracy first, then speed. With that, he walked over to Vince, who was already setting up at a lane. Beth packed up her things, trying to ignore the twinge of anxiety she felt about tomorrow's competition. As she walked out to her car, she found Lou waiting by the entrance, smoking a cigarette. Ready for tomorrow? Lou asked, stubbing out her smoke. As ready as I'll ever be, Beth replied. Lou studied her face. You know, when you showed up that first day, I wouldn't have given you a snowball's chance in hell. She smiled. Now I'm thinking about putting money on you. Vince is still the favorite, Beth pointed out. Sure, Lou agreed. On paper. But there's something about you, library lady. You've got that look my drill sergeant used to talk about. The one that says you'll keep going when everyone else quits. Beth drove home, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and calm. In her apartment, she laid out everything for tomorrow. Her clothes, her equipment, her father's gloves. Before going to bed, she opened her father's journal to a page she had read countless times over the past weeks. Competition day is just another day at the range. The targets don't know it's special. The bullets don't care who's watching. Find your quiet place and stay there. Beth slept surprisingly well that night, waking before her alarm. She ate a light breakfast, packed her range bag, and headed out earlier than necessary. The morning air was crisp, the sky turning from purple to blue as the sun rose. She took the long way to the range, using the extra time to clear her head. When she arrived, the parking lot was fuller than usual. Reynolds had invited friends and family to watch the competition, and many had shown up. Beth recognized a few regular range members among the spectators, including Walt's wife, a tiny woman with silver hair who waved at her enthusiastically. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The 12 students who had completed the course stood in small groups, checking equipment and talking quietly. Vince was at the center of the largest group, showing off his competition pistol, a custom model that cost more than Beth's monthly rent. All right, everyone, Reynolds called, gathering the class. Here's how today will work. 5 stages of increasing difficulty, scored on both accuracy and time. Perfect score is 500 points. He explained each stage in detail. Precision shooting at various distances, speed shooting, moving targets, shooting from cover, and finally, a complex course combining all elements. The winner gets a free month's membership, their name on the wall of fame, and this. Reynolds held up a gleaming trophy, significantly larger than the one from the practice competition. Second and third place get smaller prizes. Any questions? There were none. Everyone was ready to begin. The shooting order was determined by drawing numbers. Beth pulled number 9. She would be in the back half with plenty of time to watch others and prepare. Vince drew number 12. He would go last, a position that seemed to please him. Good luck to everyone, Reynolds said. We'll begin in 15 minutes. Beth found a quiet corner to prepare. She slipped on her father's gloves, feeling the familiar leather against her skin. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, finding that quiet place her father had written about. Lou appeared beside her. How are you feeling? Good, Beth said, surprised to find it was true. The nervousness from yesterday had faded, replaced by a calm focus. Those are nice gloves, Lou commented. They were my father's, Beth replied. He was a champion shooter here years ago. Lou's eyebrows rose. No kidding? Well, that explains a few things. She patted Beth's shoulder. Shooting's in your blood, then. Remember that when you're up there. The competition began. Beth watched carefully as the first shooters tackled the course, noting where they succeeded and where they struggled. The stages were indeed more challenging than the practice run, with more complicated shooting positions and tighter time constraints. The scores varied widely. Some students excelled at certain stages but struggled with others. By the time the 8th shooter finished, the highest score was 412 points out of 500, posted by a retired police officer who had shown consistent skill throughout the course. Then it was Beth's turn. She stepped up to the starting position, aware of the eyes on her but not distracted by them. Reynolds stood nearby with a stopwatch and scorecard. "Shooter ready?" he asked. Beth nodded, her father's gloves snug on her hands. Ready. The first stage was precision shooting at 25 yards. 5 shots untimed, scored purely on accuracy. Beth settled into her stance, found her grip, and focused on her breathing. She squeezed off 5 shots, each one feeling right as she released it. When the target was brought forward, all 5 shots had landed in the center ring, a perfect score for stage 1. A murmur went through the spectators. Reynolds marked her score with raised eyebrows. The second stage, speed shooting at 7 yards, went nearly as well. Beth's draw was smooth and fast, her shots controlled despite the time pressure. She lost a few points on accuracy, but made up for it with her improved speed. Stage 3 involved moving targets. This was trickier, but Beth recalled Walt's advice. Lead the target just slightly, and keep your follow-through smooth. She scored well, though not perfectly. By stage 4, shooting from various positions of cover, Beth was in a zone of complete focus. The range, the spectators, even Reynolds with his scorecard all faded into the background. There was only the target, her breathing, and the perfect moment to squeeze the trigger. When Beth completed the final stage, the complex course combining all elements, a hush fell over the range as Reynolds tallied her score. Beth removed her ear protection, suddenly aware again of her surroundings. 38 points, Reynolds announced. Current leader. Several people clapped, including Walt, who gave her a thumbs up from the sidelines. Beth felt a surge of pride, but knew the competition wasn't over. 3 shooters remained, including Vince. The next 2 shooters posted solid scores, 402 and 421, but neither surpassed Beth's 438. Then it was Vince's turn, the final competitor. Vince approached the starting position with supreme confidence, his custom pistol gleaming under the range lights. He gave Beth a small, dismissive smirk as he passed her. "Good shooting, library lady," he said. "But now watch how it's really done." Vince began his run, shooting with impressive speed and accuracy. His technique was polished, his movements efficient. By the end of stage 3, it was clear he was on pace to beat Beth's score. Beth watched calmly, her father's gloves still on her hands. Whatever happened now, she had already exceeded every expectation, including her own. She had found a part of herself and her father that had been hidden for too long. Vince entered the final stage needing a near-perfect score to win. The pressure was visible on his face now, his earlier confidence giving way to intense concentration. He moved through the course quickly, perhaps too quickly. On the final and most difficult shot, a small target at 30 yards, he rushed slightly. A miss, he fired again. Another miss. Frustration showed on his face as he took a third shot, finally hitting the target but well outside the center ring. He finished the course and stood waiting, jaw tight, as Reynolds calculated his final score. 35 points, Reynolds announced. Second place. For a moment, Vince simply stared in disbelief. Then his face flushed red as he realized what had happened. The plain woman from the library, the one he had dismissed from the first day, had beaten him by 3 points. Beth stood quietly as Reynolds presented her with the trophy. The other students gathered around, offering congratulations. Some genuine, some surprised, some reluctant. Lou gave her a bear hug, lifting her slightly off the ground. "Knew you had it in you," she said proudly. Walt approached with his wife. "Your father would have been mighty proud," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "That was some of the finest shooting I've seen on this range in years." As the crowd began to disperse, Beth found herself face to face with Vince. For a moment, he seemed unsure what to say. "Congratulations," he finally managed. Extending his hand stiffly, Beth shook it. "Thank you. You shot really well." Vince hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. "How did you do it? 6 weeks ago, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn." Beth thought about her father's journal, about Walt's guidance, about her own quiet determination. "I watched. I learned. And I didn't waste energy trying to impress anyone. As Beth walked out to her car with her trophy, Reynolds fell into step beside her. "Wilson," he said, "we're putting together a range team for the regional competition next month. We could use someone with your focus." Beth looked up at him surprised. "You want me on the team?" "You earned it," Reynolds said simply. "Think about it and let me know." Beth drove home with her trophy on the passenger seat right next to her father's shooting journal. The plain, ordinary woman whom everyone had overlooked had found her hidden strength. Not by demanding attention, but by quietly, persistently working toward excellence. As she pulled into her apartment complex, Beth realized something important. Being underestimated had indeed been her greatest advantage. People saw what they expected to see, until the moment a single perfect shot changed everything.